So welcome everybody to our September LOF&BE webinar. I'm Sarah McAllister. I'm hosting these with Sam Manzello and Sayaka Suzuki. Just a reminder that these will be posted up on YouTube for posterity. And our speaker today is Dr. Dhirendra Singh. He is a principal research fellow or associate professor at the AI discipline of School of Computing Technologies at RMIT University. He is the technical lead and the ongoing CSIRO RMIT evacuation modeling project that is building a national evacuation model capability in Australia for use by emergency management agencies. Dhirendra has over 20 years of a combined experience in academia and industry with a PhD in computer science and artificial intelligence and double bachelor's degrees in computer science and computer systems engineering. So with that, I'll let him give his talk. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat box or just when we're done, chime in and fire away. So thank you. Dhirendra, go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, actually, and be connected to this group. Okay, so I'm going to talk about evacuation modeling that we've been doing in Australia, and this is work that has been going on for quite some time now, a few years, and still ongoing. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're approaching this issue of understanding community risk from natural hazards, and I will focus more on bushfires or wildfires in this presentation, but the idea applies to other natural hazards as well, and we do work also in understanding risk for example, floods and cyclones and such. Okay, so just to start with some context. So we call them bushfires here. The wildfires, and this is quite a real risk for a lot of the communities in Australia. This is a picture of Gisborne. It's a suburb just outside of Melbourne. And so the real question that we are interested in is, well, we know it happens. So when it happens, what will the community do? And that's sort of the underlying sort of question that we've had across all of the work that we've been doing. And this leads into a lot of the risk understanding and quantification. There's been a lot of work in Australia in the past few years, and in 2009 we had the Black Saturday fires in Victoria. That's where I am located now, and a lot of people had actually died in those fires. And since then, there was a Royal Commission report that happened in Australia in 2010, and there has been quite a substantial amount of work in understanding bushfire behaviour, particularly around the decisions and what people do in terms of deciding to stay or go. And the policy in Australia used to be, you know, you should have a plan, and then plan should be either you're going to stay, or you're going to stay and defend, or you're going to leave and leave early. So we know that people stay, and it doesn't matter what we do, and because evacuations aren't mandatory in Australia, some people will stay, and so we do need to take into account considerations about why people might want to stay. Some people will wait and see, and they're trying to assess the situation and sort of postpone the decision, if you like, till they have more information. And a related question for the emergency services that want to use this kind of modeling would be, what can they do? What kind of responses that can the emergency services have that might help people make those decisions earlier? There's the issue of where people will go. And these are photos from the big fires we had in Australia in 2019-20. You can see on the picture on the right-hand side, this photo has done the rounds quite a lot, but it sort of gives you a sense that this is a community of Malakuta. They all ended up on the beach. You can see there's all kinds of concerns. People have pets. There's elderly there. There was a lot of tourists in the area, and these pictures give you a sense of that there's a lot going on, and when you're thinking about evacuations, there's a lot of things that you might want to take into account. The other part of the equation is that when you tell people to leave, that people don't simply leave. They have lives and they have responsibilities, and there's often things that they need to do before they can leave. So all of those things eventually can lead to a lot of intermediate trips that people make before they leave the region, and that adds a lot to the traffic. And in the end, we want to understand how does all of this play out in terms of what traffic might look like. And even when people do decide to leave, what does that look like? So all of these individuals making these decisions eventually plays out in some way onto the road network. And what might that mean for one community might be quite different for another. And so we want to think about these very localized kinds of concerns as well. And then there's the issue that even when people have made the decision to leave, things can go wrong. This is a picture of something that's, it's already too late. If you're in this situation, that's already too late. But the reality is that people who might be stuck in congestion or leaving in long queues may be faced with a situation that they have to do something different on their way out. So that's another thing that we want to take into account. And then on top of that, there's also the responses from the emergency services. So they are also enacting their emergency plans. They might be setting up their traffic management points, such as that one shown here. And all of that sort of plays out into, what are people going to do then? Are they going to follow those instructions? Are they going to do something different, and so on? And our goal here is to just try and capture as much of this variability as we can to try and get a sense of, again, for a given particular hazard, what might the traffic look like in a given region. Okay, so we have two tools, if you like, that we're building for the emergency services, and they serve quite different purposes, and I'll talk a little bit about both of them just to give you a sense of how they're being used. The first one is SEEKER, and that stands for Simulations of Emergency Evacuations for Knowledge, Education and Response, quite a handful. But the idea with SEEKER is to build a very detailed representation of the communities, and all of those kinds of concerns I just talked about are kind of captured. SAFER, on the other hand, is a statewide sort of risk assessment tool. And that looks at risk at a much broader and much wider scale. And I'll discuss some of those differences just in a second. But if you think about the conceptual model for all of this work, that's what it looks like. So on the whole, you can imagine lots of inputs that you might want to consider for any kind of evacuation modeling. But the three key ones are the ones that I've put in this diagram here. The first one is the hazard itself. So what are you evacuating against? And for this kind of work, it's always some sort of a hazard progression model. So that's let's say if you're talking about wildfires or bushfires, the emergency services already do a lot of fire progression modeling. And so they understand how, for a given weather conditions and the landscape and topology, how the fire might progress through that landscape. So they have a reasonable understanding of that through their modeling. What they don't get from that is an understanding of what that means for the communities. They can appreciate the spread of the fire, but not necessarily appreciate what that means for community behavior. So the fire spread, if you like, it's a time progressing shape. So you can just picture polygons spreading over the map over time, and that's effectively the input for this model. The roads, of course, we need to have some representation of all the roads in the locality, and we've got automated ways of building these routable road networks using OpenStreetMap. And then there's some sort of validation and verification you might want to do on the road network to make sure that it actually matches what the local experts understand are the issues on the roads. And then the really big and most important input in all of this is the people. So who is evacuating, you know, and where are they at the time of the event, and where will they go? And all of those kinds of inputs are what the model is most sensitive to, as you can imagine. So in terms of thinking about populations, the way we talk about those here are we're interested in, for example, the resident population, so population data that you might get from the census. We're interested in weekday and weekend populations because people do different things during the week, weekdays and weekends. There is a lot of variability in local populations in different seasons. So in Australia, when it's summer, you can expect a lot of extra tourists in sort of coastal areas. And some of the work we do, I'll talk about, is where some of these populations can expand tenfold on just a typical day, just because of the tourists. And you might also think about special events where you're trying to understand what the issues might be. Okay, and then you run these inputs through some sort of model, and I'll tell you what those models are. And what you're trying to get out is some sense of what I've labeled evacuability here, but different end users might have different things they're interested in. So for example, if it's the local council, they might be interested in a particular roundabout that they just know is of concern all the time, and they're worried that if there was evacuation, this is always going to be problematic. Or they might say, well, there's a certain artery and we know it's surrounded by this ironbark forest, and if there's a tree that fell on it, we're worried that there's going to be a lot of problems. At a statewide sort of broader level, you might be interested in other things like what is the general risk around a given area, not for a particular fire, but for a whole range of fires that could occur in that landscape. And the outputs of these sort of models can then feed into all kinds of different use cases, if you like. So we use these kinds of outputs, for example, for community education. That might mean informing the people who live there, but also the local fire brigades here have a lot are actually volunteers, and they live in the community. So the community includes the local fire brigades as well. And you can think about risk management from a statewide level, for example, how to plan for the seasonal burning that happens to try and to minimize the risk in certain parts of the landscape. And so there's various other end use cases, including, for example, township emergency planning and so on. Just to give you a sense of what the difference between these tools are, and I'll go a little bit into these shortly as well. So in terms of the scale, we're talking at a state level. So state here means the state of Victoria, for example. It's quite a few 100 square kilometers, quite big, you know, could be the size of a small European country. And the regions are smaller, so the states have lots of different regions broken up into shires, which is the administrative sort of government, the local government. So it's quite naturally the sort of scale at which you might want to operate. The use cases in this particular instance, for the case of the statewide evacuation risk, we're trying to get some sort of aggregated risk across a whole bunch of fires. And when I say multiple fires, I'm talking up to 1 million fires. So we have 1 million simulations and tell us what the risk is. On the other hand, Seeker is looking at a very detailed, nuanced sort of scenario for a given fire. And all of the slides I showed you up front, those kinds of nuanced sort of issues are what we would try and capture in the Seeker tool. And they for that reason, they also have very different approaches. Safer uses a mathematical optimization, sort of, it's a very fast model, gives you a coarse and quick understanding of risk. Seeker is very detailed, it's an agent-based model, and requires, for that purpose, quite a lot of input as well. Road infrastructure, the input is very similar in both the cases. With Seeker, we go the extra mile by also then talking to the local experts in the Shire to verify that network, maybe change speed limits, for example, where they might say, oh, look, OpenStreetMap says this is a 100-kilometer-an-hour road, but we know it's a dirt road, and the best you can do is about 60. So we drop the speed on that. Or they might say, look, you've drawn through OpenStreetMap that there's a road here, but this is actually just a dirt track and no one uses it, so you might as well remove it. So it's some sort of a verification to try and get a good sense of that it matches the reality in the area. You can input all kinds of hazards. These names probably won't make much sense to people outside of Australia, but these are just tools that are used for fire progression modeling in Australia. So Phoenix and Aurora and Spark, these are all fire progression models. So in SAFER, this is predominantly built for bushfire sort of risk assessment. Seeker is quite general in that regard. You can as long as you have a time progressing shape, it could be any hazard, and we easily swap fires for floods in that case. The population, that's as I mentioned, is what the models can be most sensitive to, and the population in the statewide model is aggregated spatial counts. So effectively, you should just think about a raster with the grid cells and numbers in them. So it says here's the density of the population, and typically it's the residential density, but you could also produce rasters that might capture the seasonal density. And then in Seeker, we have a disaggregated population, which means that we are actually modeling synthetic agents, synthetic individuals, if you like. We model where they live, where they work. Effectively what you get is the whole travel diary of a person for the whole day. And you can play out the simulation and watch them drive around the map and do their thing. And at some point you inject the fire in the landscape and then they do something different. So when we talk about behaviors, then the SAFER model just assumes it's a homogeneous sort of population, homogeneous behaviors, and really just saying, just leave. When we tell you to leave, leave immediately. That's the assumed behavior in that case. It's a very simple model. Whereas in Seeker, you have a heterogeneous population. You can have subpopulations such as residents or daytime visitors or overnight visitors and such, and they might have slightly different understanding of the region and therefore slightly different behaviors. And the individuals in these agent-based simulations are making contextualized choices. So what that means is that as the fire is progressing through the landscape and based on where this particular agent is on the map, they might do something different compared to another agent in a different part of the map. And that's not simply just based on proximity to the hazard, but it's also based on their own circumstances, such as whether they have dependents to attend to and what their risk propensity is, and their behavior persona is. So there's quite a lot of detailed modeling that goes on. And then, as you can expect, then the data preparation effort, it's important to highlight that, is also varies. So if you have a coarse model, the idea with the SAFER tool is, even though we're trying to assess fires, assess risk across up to 1 million fires, we want it to be almost hands-off. And so therefore, we want minimum user interaction, and we want to make assumptions and choices that are sensible, that would give us a good sense of the risk with minimal effort required from the user. On the other hand, the Seeker tool, the idea is to really dive down into the nuances of a particular community, and therefore it does require a lot of input from local experts, from GIS experts to understand where people work and where people spend their time, all these kinds of things. And so the effort required could be quite significant. And so it does depend on how much buy-in you can get from various people in that region to be able to help build such kind of models. But it's a one-off effort. So once you've got that data, you can then do lots of scenarios. If we think about the emergency management response in these models, in SAFER, it's kind of an implicit assumption, evacuate now. That's what we're saying. everyone evacuate now and everyone behaves the same way, what do you get? Whereas in Seeker, it's quite nuanced. You can have the emergency services send messages to people in the landscape. You can target messages to certain parts of the map. You can send different kinds of messages. For example, in Australia, we have different levels of intensity for the messages. You can have an advice message, which just says, there's a fire in the landscape, please be aware. It could be a watch and act message or an emergency warning and leading up to an evacuate now message. So all of those types of messages you could send in the Seeker model and see how the community then responds to it. So not only can you target the messages to certain parts of the map, you can also decide what points in time through the fire progression you're sending those messages. On top of the messages, you can also set up these traffic management points, like the picture I showed you earlier, where there's a manned police car that sort of directs traffic. So you can also set these kinds of traffic management points up in the simulation and see how then that changes the outcomes, the consequences for evacuation. And then you can also do all kinds of what ifs in terms of accidents and roadblocks and fallen trees and things like that, if you want to understand in more detail what those kinds of things might mean for a particular community. And the idea is you want to run all kinds of variations, lots of different scenarios to try and build some sense of what your emergency planning should look like. The outputs for the models, you get it's a coarse model, like I said, with spatial counts as input. So you get counts and flows as outputs in the safer model. It's sort of aggregated. You can't drill down into people. Whereas Seeker gives you, again, it's the trajectories of individuals and the exact movement. So you could literally play it back, click on an agent and ask all kinds of questions about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and so on. So it can explain why certain people might be doing certain things. But then again, you want to understand risk at a combined level in that case as well, although you can inspect people individually. In terms of performance, then you also get faster performance. That was the whole design purpose of the Safer tool. When I say seconds per run, it means for each fire, when we compute the evacuation scores, if you like, we could do it within, say, 5 seconds. And this is, whereas in the Seeker tool, each run, it is quite a detailed run with the fire progressing and people moving around and so on, and can take up to 5 to 20 minutes, depending on how many people and how much planning is happening, because routing and replanning is a costly computing effort. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of what the differences are. I'll go into a little bit of detail now into the models. So just to give some pictures to represent all the stuff that I've been talking about. So here's one of the inputs, the very first input I mentioned, which was the hazard. So this is what it looks like for us. It's an example. Here, this is actually just northwest of Melbourne, and I'm almost on the map where I'm stationed right now. So this is a fire that is a projected fire. The colors here represent the timing of the fire. So the darker colors represent earlier timestamps and the lighter colors are later timestamps. So you can kind of gauge that this fire starts in the darkest part of that map and then progresses in a southeasterly direction. And after some wind change, it moves in a northeasterly direction. So it sort of forms this sort of a curve. So that's an input for us. Just to give you a sense of what the road inputs look like, here's the same area with the roads represented. The colors here represent speeds, and the thickness represents the capacities of those roads, the flow capacities. And you can, like I mentioned before, not every road is captured. You can kind of make out that there's other roads in the background which aren't represented, and that would be because we've had those conversations with the local experts and made those choices. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the population now in terms of how we build the population for the Seeker tool. So I mentioned that we try and capture a lot of aspects about these individuals.
Now, just thinking back on all the research that has happened in Australia in the past around behaviors, there's been a lot of work, and including this one, which is what we use, to look at, well, when we ask people what they did in previous fires and see if we can classify those behaviors into some sort of behavior personas, then some of that work has resulted in these personas. And the idea here is that these kinds of behaviors, and I'll give you some examples, they represent the kinds of behaviors that people typically have. It seems that these kinds of personas are also pretty stable. So when we look at different communities, they seem to kind of hold. You get these kinds of behaviors. Just to give you some example, a threat denier, for example, might be a person who doesn't even believe there's a risk or a threat to worry about. And a responsibility denier, on the other hand, might be someone who believes there's a threat, but also believes that it's not their responsibility to worry about it. Someone will knock on their door. The emergency services will send them a text or tell them when to leave or what to do. So they fully rely on the emergency services. That's the perception anyway, in terms of how they should be responding. And then you can imagine other types, and I won't go into all of them, but you can easily picture these kinds of people in communities. And what we do is then we try and come up with some method of assigning these behavior personas to the synthetic agents that we build for these communities. So that's to just look at who are these people and what kind of behaviors they might have. The other thing we want to know is what do they do? And the reason we want to know this is because when the fire happens, we want to know where people are and what they're doing. And so one way to do that would be to just model their daily lives. Like I mentioned, these travel diaries. So here's an example. A person sort of leaves home, goes to work, goes to the shop after work, maybe via the beach, comes back home, and that's their day. So this is their proposed day, if you like, before or irrespective of any hazard. And so you can already play out these simulations and watch these people go about their day. That's what it looks like. And then on top of that, we then add to them these behavior personas, like I mentioned, that then dictate what they will do when there's a fire. So when you put a fire in the landscape, then this person suddenly has changed their behavior, and maybe after work, they're no longer going to the shops. They've decided to actually go home and then evacuate. Right, so you can imagine people will do different kinds of things, and our intent here is to capture all the kinds of things that people do, build in that variability, and then see what that looks like for the traffic. Here's a little picture of how all of that sort of comes together. It's the same fire and the same road network I showed you earlier. So this is, you can see there's a clock there. So this is just past noon. This is an hour into the fire, so you can see that the shape has progressed a little bit. It doesn't look as big as I showed you earlier at this point in time. You can make out these different triangles in different colors. So these are cars driving around. The colors here represent the different personas, just to give you a sense of that there's people of different personas, different behavior profiles spread all over the landscape, as you might imagine. Although some of those will do certain kinds of behaviors more than others. So maybe you see these yellow type of people doing certain kinds of things at that point in time. You might also notice that there's some triangles pointing towards the fire. In fact, they seem like they're going towards the fire, and that is the case. And these would be people who are actually doing these intermediate trips. They have other things to attend to before they will leave, if they leave. Maybe they're just going home and they're just going to stay there. Maybe they will go and pick on some dependents and leave from there, or just wait there and delay the decision. So all these kinds of things are sort of happening in the background. You can make out some white dots. These are locations of these kind of dependents. So people have gone to those places and they're stationary at those places, and they will decide from there. You can also make out these pink dots. These are people who are becoming aware of the situation.
and they may be becoming aware because they are close to the fire. They may be becoming aware because they have just also received a message, and all of these inputs just compound over time, and eventually people say, right, there is a problem and I need to think about what my response will be. So, and people are sort of coming to that realization at different points in time in the simulation, as you can imagine. The big blues that you see all over the place, that's just people in their residences in the area. And I live just there, if you can see my cursor. Just on the south part of the map. Okay, so how is this tool? So this was the underlying model, but then there's a tool that the emergency services can use. This is a web-based tool. So what can you do with it, and how do you use it? So the idea is that you first select a region. So it's you pick a part of the map that you care about. So it could be at the Shire level, for example. As you pick that region, the web-based interface sort of zooms into that region, and you can see the road network representation of that region and the underlying map, which could be a satellite-based map or the typical kinds of maps you'd be used to seeing in, let's say, OpenStreetMap. And once you've picked a region, you then choose the hazard. So the idea being that all of these fires have previously already been simulated, and these are inputs. So the emergency services have already entered a whole bunch of fires for the area that they might want to understand the risk against. So you pick the fire you care about. Then you pick the population. And like I said, you could have the seasonal population or census population and so on. And that kind of captures most of the situation. The rest is to then decide what you're going to do about it. So for the emergency services, what response are they going to then apply to this situation to then decide to see what might happen? So these are all the what if scenarios that you could then build. You might want to set no responses and just see what would happen if we didn't interfere. What's kind of the baseline here in terms of people evacuating, which will be people self-evacuating. Or you might say, what happens if we send these kinds of messages at these times? What if we mix that up with traffic management points and so on? So you can imagine the kinds of things they're already thinking of. You can now just enter into this tool and try and get a sense of a little bit of a data-driven idea, if you like, of what might happen. Okay, I'll give you an example, carrying on with the same example. So here's a couple of baseline scenarios for the same pictures I showed you earlier. So the baseline is, well, let's not do anything, see what happens. And then the second scenario is we'll send a sequence of targeted messages over time. So here's the same picture again. On the left-hand side is the scenario where there's no messaging. On the right-hand side, we'll send these messages at those points in time. And people will then respond to those in different ways. The clock says 11 o'clock at the moment. So on the right-hand side, you will see a message go in 10 minutes once I play this video. And people responding, becoming aware of the situation, as I said, will be these flashes of pink. And then you'll see people driving around as well. So let's just hit play and see what that might look like. So the fire is sort of progressing in the landscape in the top corner, as you can see. Right now, things don't look terribly different in each side, but as now we're getting close to noon, there'll be another message on the right-hand side. So you see there's starts to become a little bit more traffic on the right-hand side than the left, and that's because more and more people are getting to know about it, and therefore they are enacting their plans. And what we're trying to get a sense of is, well, do we get enough people out of harm's way in the right-hand side compared to the left, for example? On the left-hand side, you will see a lot more traffic at the moment, and that's because the fire is getting bigger and the people are now realizing there's a big fire near them. And so a lot of the commotion is around the fire front. You will see shortly also a big change in the shape of the fire because of the wind change, it starts moving towards that township, which is very close to it. and that will produce a lot more people moving out of that town because they are now suddenly under a lot more threat. So here you can see the fires now moving towards that township, and then there's a lot more people who've decided it's not a good idea to stick around. So and again, all of these people are doing all kinds of things, moving towards the fire when they are trying to go to a location that's more important to go to than leave the area. And then the dots you can see within the fire itself, the blue dots, those are people who've decided to stay. There's always people who will stay. And we're not making any assumptions here about what happens to them, but this is just to say that you will get certain percentage of people not leaving. Okay, so that hopefully gives you an idea of what the underlying model looks like. But of course, while those videos are extremely useful for a lot of purposes, they also don't tell you the full story in terms of numbers. And it's hard to tell when you're looking at a stream of cars moving around, whether there's 50 or 500 sometimes. So the web-based tool, therefore, then also has these outputs which are zone-based. So we cut up the map into zones, and then zones could represent whatever the emergency services think of the area as in terms of zones. And then we can just produce numbers from the simulation to say, at a given point in time, how many people were in different parts of the map. So this is the same two simulations. It's 1 p.m. on the clock here. And the colors here are showing how many people are in the zones. So the reds represent more people in zones and the greens represent less people in zones. So you can just very quickly visually tell that the right-hand side in general has less peoples in this area than the left-hand side. And that's because of the messaging that was sent in the right-hand side scenario. You can zoom out, and here I've moved the time slider forward. So this is now 5 p.m., so 6 hours into the fire. And we're looking at a bigger part of the map just to get a sense. And again, you can see on the right-hand side, it's a lot greener around the fire than otherwise. And that's the kind of, and this is us trying to build a sense of what are good user interfaces that can help emergency services quickly gauge differences between scenarios and so on. So this is, I should say that all this work is almost completely driven by interaction with the emergency services. This is not us imposing ideas on them. This is a collaborative co-development sort of exercise that's been going on for many years. So we're all evolving our thinking as we do this. We build new interfaces, learn from it, and then we revise them and in this sort of iterative fashion. I'm just going to give you one example of how we've used this in the past and out of all the different use cases. So here's a little exercise we did just before Christmas last year, where it was a training exercise for the emergency services. So they do this in the season before the fire to try and hone in on their planning and their response strategies for certain situations. So the day looks like, well, it's a control room. Everyone's in this room. You can sort of make out there's a room with lots of people in it, wearing different colors to represent the different agencies they're from. And there's a fire happening outside in the world. It's a big fire. And information about the fire is getting injected into this room at certain points in time. So it's a live event, if you like. It's a real-time event in that way. So, for example, at 10 a.m., someone rings from the smoke tower to say, we can see smoke, and then that activates a certain response inside the room, and so it goes. And so we're injecting more information through the day. So we used our, so here's the fire. For those of you who don't know, this is just the Great Ocean Road area. It's a very famous touristic part of the world, very touristic drives here. But it's also a big fire risk area. So this is just in the southwest of Melbourne. This just shows you the extent of the fire. This is an extremely big fire, moves very fast, and sort of cuts across those townships that I've listed over there. I might skip through a lot of the details of what we did in this population itself. But what we tried to do is capture a midday population with lots of different user groups, sort of subgroups in the population, and all of these kinds of assumptions, such as not everyone receives the messages, or what happens when people leave. All of these kinds of things are based on the conversations about this particular scenario with the emergency services, and we come up with what we wanted to capture with respect to that typical day. Okay, and then what we do is in the landscape we inject the fire and then the responses, such as the traffic management points that as shown in this picture, with the arrows showing where traffic is not allowed to go. The colors here, the colored dots, again represent people doing different activities. So you can see home, work, shop, and so on. So people going about their day at 11 a.m. That's where people are and doing what we think they would be doing on a day like that. We model lots of different what if scenarios, such as what happens if you try to evacuate everyone as fast as you can. What happens if you stage the evacuation by ordering different townships to go at different points in time? What happens if you mix it up with also the traffic management points directing the flow and so on? So we model the kinds of things that they would expect to do on that day. This is a setup at the start of in the front of that room that I just showed you a picture of. And then this at noon, our role in this exercise was to stop all the activities and brief the teams on all the modeling that was done in terms of evacuation. So we showed them all the modeling that we did. We explained to them all the different scenarios we had modeled and what the outcomes were. And the purpose was to then have the incident controller decide what they're going to do about it. Here's one of the slides that we actually presented on the day that's just talking about the reduction in risk against the different scenarios, but not looking at the numbers at all. The third scenario here was better than others, but all the scenarios ended up being really bad. In fact, in every scenario, there was hundreds or thousands of people stuck on the roads when the fire actually overran that area. So our recommendation actually was that none of these evacuation scenarios are suitable for this rapid onset fire. And in fact, the best course of action is that people should shelter in place in those townships. So that was our recommendation to the incident controller. It was quite interesting for us because we found that even though our role in the exercise was to come and brief the team and then let them make the decision, we found that when they made the decision, they wanted to keep coming back to us, and they were always asking us, can you bring up the modeling again? We want to see what was happening in this area, or we're trying to understand what we should do about this situation. So we found that even though it wasn't planned, people found it very useful to interact with the modeling through the day. We also found that we observed that people wanted to use the video-based output with the cars driving around and seeing the fire progress. We found that people wanted to interact with that more than they did with the map-based outputs. And we also found that because they were finding it useful, they also would have liked the modeling to be updated as they were making decisions. So what they wanted was, well, we made the decisions, now you should update your modeling and tell us what your prediction is about what will happen now. And they wanted to use it in that way. So that was quite interesting. Okay, I'm gonna now quickly talk about the SAFER tool and just give you a different sense of how that tool is getting used. So just to give you a sense of the scale. So in this picture, I've got a little black box in the middle, close to this township of Traralgon. So that's one fire, right? And all the other dots that you can make out in this picture are all ignition points of fires. So that's, like I said, is an input for us. So here's a set of fires that have been simulated on the map. In fact, they are ignitions that were placed at every 1 square kilometer of the entire state. So that gives you a few 100,000 fires for a given weather condition, and then you do it for different weather conditions, and suddenly you have a lot of fires. So our design goal here is to firstly come up with a solution in terms of an estimate of risk on the same day. So we want to know, and we want an answer. We've done the modeling, and we want to know an answer today. Is the design constraint. We have, close to 1 million fires. If you look at the road infrastructure in terms of computing, we've got, about 10 to the 5 number of nodes and links in this road network. We have about 10 to the 3 roughly number of communities in this landscape. And we want to compute against each fire the risk to each community evacuating on those roads. So that's the design goal. The way we do it is we quickly, we have a very simple model. It needs to be simple because of the scalability issue here. And so here's a toy example of just to give you a sense of what the model is doing. So here is the nodes here represent nodes on the road network. You can see some arrows in the background as well. Those are links of the road network, so it's a directed graph. The orange here represents a fire in the landscape. So the node 50 is where the ignition point of the fire is. The yellow is the extent of the fire. So in this particular case, we do not have the timing information. So all we know is where did the fire start and how big it gets. And that's purely because the amount of data that would require to be generated becomes huge. So already we have 1 million fires, and just this amount of data is already 50 gigs worth of input. And if you also were to add timing, it suddenly blows out too much. So in the end, the emergency services give us this data, which is here's the fire ignition and here's the extent. Tell us what that means. So let's now imagine there's a community node inside this fire envelope. That's node 61. That's the blue node. And the question is, well, we want to evacuate. Tell us what it means to evacuate this node. Now, like I said, we don't want to put a lot of onus on the user to give us inputs, because we have 1 million of these and we can't keep asking them about where should we send people and all these sort of things. So we have to make sensible assumptions about it. So you have to then ask the question, well, where do you want to send these people? And one answer could be, well, anywhere that's not the fire. So which basically means any node that is not yellow. So here I've just, for example, colored all the nodes in green, which are just the nodes outside the fire front. And you might say, well, okay, that's reasonable enough to say, let's get the people out just outside the fire as a starting point. You can also then say, well, how many of these should we pick? Are these all exit nodes? Do we pick one of them? Do we pick some of them? And again, you can think of lots of heuristics in how you might decide that. But here I've just picked a subset of dark green nodes to say we want to evacuate people to those nodes. And these are just nodes that are sort of pointing away from the ignition and in the closest beeline sort of distance away, if you like. But you can have other heuristics for picking these sort of nodes. But once you've decided where you want to send people, then it's simply a matter of computing mathematically what's the fastest rate at which you can release these people out of node 61, if you like. And that's you can think about it as it's called the max flow problem. It's a pretty standard problem in optimization, and there's lots of standard solutions for it. So we've just framed the problem in that way, and basically you can think of it as the blue node 61 is a tap. All the roads are these pipes, and then the green nodes are the sinks, and you're just trying to figure out what's the maximum flow out of node 61. And as you can imagine, that the constricting part of all of this would be the thickness of those pipes, which is the capacities of the roads. And so a solution, which is the one that's colored here in green and black. So this is saying this is the fastest paths you can get the paths you get for the maximum flow out of 61 into those green nodes. The black lines, the black links here represent those critical links, the ones that are the ones constricting the flow, if you like. So that's also useful information because it tells you that those are the links maybe you need to pay more attention to. Maybe you want to also do some future road infrastructure planning and improve those links, because that will actually improve the flow out for people. So that can be useful. Okay, but that's a very simple model in itself. It runs very fast and it gives you a solution very quickly. You can have many blue nodes in this fire and it still gives you the same quick solution of interweaving flows as well. It sort of scales fine for that. I'll give you a quick view of some of the outputs. So this is the input population raster. So this is just the density of the population around Melbourne. This is the Bay of Melbourne, just below the whites that you can see. So here's a view of the risk, for example, and this is showing you the risk on the road network from all of those fires. So the million fires, looking at evacuating against all of those fires, which links were critical for those fires, and then aggregating that up to give you the sense of which links tend to be the most critical for all of those evacuations. And the idea is to then get a sense of, well, are certain parts of the map more problematic than others? So here, for example, the fatter links are the ones which we find end up being a little bit more problematic generally across all those fires. And that's the idea. We're not thinking about a single event, we're thinking across the board, where could problems exist. You can then turn the lens to not the links, but say, well, which fires were impacting those links? So which fires tend to impact the most road infrastructure links heavily? And so the sizes here, these are ignition points, and the sizes here represent the fires that impact more flows, if you like. And again, certain parts of the map light up, and so that's what we're trying to do here, is get these hot spots, if you like, and that's telling us, well, certain fires that start in certain parts of the landscape tend to be more problematic for the road infrastructure and evacuation flows. By the way, the Black Saturday fires of 2009, when lots of people died, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this part of the map, which is just on the north east of Melbourne CBD. Okay, this is another view of the risk, but now saying color the ignition points of fires based on the total population they affect. So again, it's a simple but useful metric that says if fires start in these parts of the map, then they tend to impact more populations because there's nearby population centers. I mean, it's a simple but quite a useful metric. And a slightly more nuanced one, and you can't see too many of these points here, but if we just look at the green nodes here, those are representing a community node. So these are all community nodes, but these are colored based on the mean time to evacuate. So that's to say, across all the fires and all the evacuations for that community node, what was the average time it took to evacuate and the mean of that. So that's a function not only of the size of the community node, but it's a function also of the interconnecting roads that are used for egress. So again, certain townships and community areas light up, and again, the idea is to then drill down and assess whether there's real risks in those areas, and that's just a picture of the whole thing together. Okay, we're also building a web interface for all of this tool as well, very similar. Here's a little picture of that. And just, I'm going to finish with this slide just to say these are two very different tools with very different modeling assumptions and very different kinds of outputs you can get. And this is just to say a little bit about, well, how do we use these and where are they used, what are they useful for? So outputs like where you're looking at single what-if scenarios and what's happening for a very specific event, single runs are useful still. I mean, they're useful for community education, they're useful for understanding localized risks and just building community resilience, for example. But if you really want to use these kinds of tools for planning, you want to run lots of runs. So ensembles with different fires, lots of assumptions around the population and so on to get a general feel for where the risks might be. And that's where both of the tools are quite useful. But as you can imagine, a lot of people also want to now use these tools for incident control. So when is a fire happening? Can we do this? Can we use these? And the answer right now is no, you can't, because that heavily relies on a good understanding of where people are. And we don't have that level of data at the moment to be able to say, this is where the population is, and therefore that's what could happen. Okay, I've taken quite a lot of time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, those are great tools that you've shown us. So yeah, thank you again for your talk and describing these. I'll open it up for questions. So again, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute or use the chat box. In the meantime, I have a few because these are really interesting tools. So I'm curious, you showed Melbourne at the end where you used the SAFER model, but could you do Seeker on Melbourne, or is there like an upper limit to like the size of the community at this point?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, this is a good picture of Melbourne too. So, the Seeker model you could use, I don't know if you can see my cursor when I move it, can you?
I see your cursor, it's not moving.
Okay. There might be a nicer way to do this, which I don't know how to point it out, but maybe I'll try and just point it out with labels. So if you look at the bottom part of the map where it says Great Otway National Park, Lorne, Aries Inlet, if you can make out those coastal townships, that's directly left of the word safer.
Okay.
All of that part of the coast. That is a shire, so that's Surf Coast Shire. So we use Seeker at that sort of scale. We do have Seeker level modeling for all of Melbourne, so 4 million agents doing their thing. But we don't also get a lot of fires within Melbourne because it's very urban. So so the general use for Seeker ends up being around the regions, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very, very interesting. You mentioned like in Seeker that it seems like you're incorporating these intermediate trips. Like, how are you modeling that right now?
Yeah, so what happens is, right, so what happens is we have a loose notion that people have some things to do, and so it just becomes a variable in their persona, if you like. What that means is when they start to react, they first check, are there any dependents I need to check on? And the notion of dependence is loose. It could involve going to pick up kids or pick up your horses or just attending on an elderly person, you know. So, but the idea that you have to be somewhere else before you can make the decision to leave. And so people will sometimes, in the model, independently, each individual will decide, okay, I've decided that I need to go and check on someone at this location. And I've also decided I also want to go home. And so they might even do things like, okay, home is closer, I'll go there first, then I'll go to this person, then I'll wait there and then decide whether I'll leave from there or maybe I don't leave at all. Or they might, so you can get all these kinds of variations just based on those variables.
Okay, so it's sort of like an assumed distribution of so many people are going to make these extra trips, so many people aren't. And
absolutely, and that comes from that local understanding. They might say, yes, I've been working in this area for the last 20 years and I know all this happens and I'm going to say at least 30% of the people are going to do this. I'm like, okay, well, we'll just put that as a number.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to another question I have. I see Sam type one in, but do different locations, are they given different like distributions of personas for these models? Okay.
Yes, correct. So what we did was we, for the different regions, we tried to just assign personas based on the demographics. So you get and different communities have different demographics, so you get slightly different distributions, yeah.
I gotcha. Cool. That's really neat. So Sam typed in, great talk, and he wants to know if you can explain how you're partnering with CSIRO in more detail.
Yeah, sure. So so the whole work is a collaboration between CSIRO and RMIT University, and to be more precise, the Seeker tool is the collaboration, the very nuanced behavior modeling tool. We started doing this work as a research sort of exercise because my background is in behavior modeling and simulation. So we were doing this work in RMIT for quite some time. CSIRO had started investing resources in understanding evacuation risk as a separate exercise. And at some point, when we found out about each other through a lot of discussions, we ended up actually consolidating those two projects, because it also made it easier for the community's service of the emergency services here, because there's a few different groups trying to do this, and at the moment it's this big consolidated effort that sort of works together. So a lot of this work, in fact, most of this work is funded through CSIRO, and we have a lot of grants and funding in CSIRO that then streams into RMIT and so on. So there's a group that works on all of this in CSIRO, and there's a group that works at RMIT, and we like one big team.
Neat, that's exciting. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. If there aren't any more questions, I'll give another second or two for questions, but I will make the announcement that if you've missed the emails, this is our last speaker for the seminar series. So this will be the last video that will be up on YouTube. So our last month, so the month of October, will just be a round robin chat with Sam Sayaka and I. So please come out and bring us your questions and complaints or compliments, whatever you feel like. We'll just be talking for an hour, but it won't be posted on YouTube. So thank you again for rounding out our seminar series with a really awesome talk on these really cool tools. I really enjoyed it. And thank you everybody for your support for the webinar series. So if there's more questions.
Thanks so much for having me. It's just been fantastic to be here.
Yeah, well, indeed. Thank you very much.
Great talk. We appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Catch up soon.